But the first, now we're going over to Dantar Oosterwal, who is the chair of the upcoming conference and also the brain behind the setup of going and seeing and learning together. So take it off, Dantar.
Thank you, Peter. First of all, I just want to say, Rich, that was absolutely fantastic. It really resonated in so many ways.
Thank you.
And also, thank you for opening your doors and letting us come in a couple months. I think this whole idea of sharing and creating a culture where we can share amongst ourselves and learn from each other is absolutely huge. So I just want to say thank you for that. So I'm going to take a little bit different tact in where we're going to go with this conversation. Clearly, we've talked already. We've got a conference coming up October 2 through 5 in Ann Arbor. And the theme that we've created for this conference is creating a culture of innovation. And one of the items that Peter had asked about now is kind of talk about learning circles and the role of learning. One of the things that we'll be doing is for me, I think it's important to practice some of the techniques, some of the tools, some of the ideas when we're together. So what we'll be doing as part of this conference is actually exercising learning circles. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time to talk about what is the role of learning when we're creating a culture of innovation, and what is a learning circle. So that's the intent of my time today. I'll start out with this picture here and ask the question, what's learning got to do with it? And there's an interesting excerpt here from Charles Darwin in his Origin of Species book. He says it's not the most intellectual of the species that survives. It's not the strongest that survives. But the species that survives is the one that's able to adapt to and to adjust best to the changing environment in which it finds itself. So I've always been inspired by that, because if we relate that to how that fits for us, I would translate that to say that the real story is about human creativity. It's about curiosity. It's about experimentation. It's about learning. That's how we survive. That's how we survive as a being. That's how we survive as a company. So in the end, it's really about what's our rate of learning. And I would say it really comes down to he who learns fastest wins, right? And so if we take that even further, it's important to recognize that how we learn and how that learning rate evolves really has a big impact on how we deliver innovation. So I'm going to start out with an example here. And this example is probably something that many of you are aware of. And this is the improvement of computational capability, right? Or otherwise known as Moore's Law. And I find this fascinating that all the way back in 1965, Gordon Moore predicted that on average, computational capability would double every 2 years. And that's quite fascinating. And really what Moore's Law describes is this long-term trend in the history of computer software. Now, at the time, it was how many transistors can you place on a circuit board and make it affordable. And indeed, if we look back 50 years, half a century, it's pretty much met that. Every 2 years, the capacity has doubled. And you look at how that learning has progressed year over year over year to be able to make that happen, and how that's enabled the technologies that we deal with today. The computer that you're watching this on right now, the cell phone in your pocket, those are all capabilities that have evolved based on the learning and the learning rates that we create. But it's also important to recognize it's not just the learning rate. It's important to recognize that rate actually accelerates over time. The rate of learning, the rate of improvement accelerates. And I'll take a very simple example. We'll look at the speed of human locomotion. So if you think back 3 million years ago, when they tell us that humans first started to walk, we're able to to transverse to move at 3 miles per hour. Right? So sure, you can go faster for short periods, but if you're going to go for a long distance, we can go about 3 miles per hour. It wasn't until about 5,000 years ago that we domesticated horses, and we went from 3 miles per hour to a whopping 10 miles per hour, that we could do a sustained speed of 10 miles an hour. Then you look at the 1830s with the Industrial Revolution and locomotives, and all of a sudden we were able to do 50 miles per hour. 1930 airplanes, we were able to move at 150 miles an hour. By the 1950s, we had jets, and we would go 500 miles an hour, just to be able to move. By 1970, we had a space shuttle, and it was going 15,000 miles per hour. Now we've got the SpaceX 25,000 miles per hour. So what we see is it's not just the rate of learning, but to be competitive, we also have to accelerate. And there's an interesting piece that was put out by one of the technology officers at Nvidia, which is one of the global AI computing companies. They recently identified that technology's improvement rate, according to them, was now running 3 to 5 times faster than just 10 years ago. And he said, and I find this quite fascinating, if your company's ability to learn and improve isn't similarly accelerating, well, don't let that happen. That is quite mind-blowing to recognize that it's not just that we have to learn well, we have to learn faster. It's how we compete. And again, the one who learns the fastest wins. We see this over and over. The other piece that I think is really critical now is if you believe that the learning is important and that it powers innovation, it's important to recognize that the role of innovation, of the innovation process, in what it does is to close that gap between what we know at the beginning of a project and what we need to know before we can introduce that innovation. So in all of our companies and the work that we do when we're dealing with innovation, it really becomes that system, that process, that mechanism by which we can close the learning gap between when we have an idea or when we have a question and when we can actually go execute that. So it really comes down to our ability to discover, share, and apply learning, which in the end dictates our innovation efficiency. Now, why is this important? If we look at firms and the effectiveness of firms, firms that are more efficient in innovation have higher market valuations. They have superior operating performance, market valuations, and stock returns. And this is based on a study that was published in Financial Economics not too long ago. So what we're seeing is, as an organization, an innovative organization, being able to learn effectively, being able to be efficient in translating that learning into innovation is a huge aspect of being effective. So let me take this to the next piece and ask the question, well, how does one learn? How does the learning occur? Well, most of us, I'm going to assume, are engineers or scientists or in some type of a technical field. We're probably applying a scientific method. Now, a scientific method's been around since, well, at least the 17th century. And so this is something that we have become accustomed to in applying in the way that we learn as a technical group. And simply the process is just that, through testing and experimentation, we identify what works, what doesn't work. And there's a basic process to that. The first is the idea that there's some question that needs to be answered. Once we identify the question, then it becomes a question of doing some research and then creating a hypothesis, creating a prediction. What do we think is going to happen? Doing experimentation to vet that, doing the data analysis, and then finally communicating it. And this becomes a very, very important cycle that we find in many cases, even though this is what we may have learned in school and learned how to do and enjoy doing, it goes away in most organizations. When there's an opportunity, it's immediately something that says, okay, go deliver it. We don't take the time to really do the research, the hypothesis, the prediction, the learning that's necessary. And so this is something that we see as we start getting into lean product development. And I figured I'll take a moment here and say, how does this scientific method, how does this learning, how is that applied in lean product development? And so I'll characterize those. On the left-hand side here, I just look at lean product development, and hopefully many of you have seen these slides before, but I want to characterize it now as to how it ties to the scientific method. So if we look at lean product development, the first thing that we have is some kind of idea, or we have some kind of a business opportunity, or we have some kind of a question that needs to be sorted out, which correlates in the scientific method for the question. Now, within development, not all ideas get executed. Not all questions have the opportunity to get answered. So we have a firewall. And once we decide it's something that's worth working on, whether it's a business opportunity or some kind of concept or idea, the first thing we want to do is do the research. We want to find the limits. We understand what we know and what we don't know. And that ties directly into the second step of the scientific method. Once we do that research, our whole intent then is to tie into the knowledge base. What is the knowledge that we have today? What does that base look like? How do our limit and trade-off curves look? And this is where we're able to construct a hypothesis. This is where we're able to do the prediction based on past experience, based on how we understand things operate within the safe zone that we've created. Now, within the lean development process, it may be far more complex. There might be other systems involved. There might be other parts of the organization that are involved. So we do a lot of detailing, mixing, and matching of information. But ultimately, what comes out of that is this notion of, well, what is it that we need to learn? What is that gap that we need to close in order to be able to get the innovation out to our customers in a meaningful way? And this is where we see the whole idea of a proactive learning cycle. Once we identify what that gap is, that's where we do our experimentation and our data analysis, exactly what we see in the scientific method. Once we finish one of these proactive learning cycles, those end in integration events. And the integration event is where we're able to communicate this. This is where we have an opportunity to go across the entire organization and share our learnings. And this then, at this point, identifies, are we ready to go to a launch, or do we have more learning that actually needs to occur? And so what we see here is we see this learning approach, we see this whole notion of the scientific method deeply embedded in the way that we look at lean product development, which quite frankly is often overlooked when we think about traditional methods where we set out requirements and immediately try and develop a product out of it, rather than spending the time to figure out what the knowledge is that we need to go create and then systematically go and doing it. So I want to take that and boil it down to really the essence of what's involved in learning. What does it take to actually learn? And what we find is that for learning to occur, it has to move between two domains, and those domains are the domains of thinking and doing. And this comes from work that was done by John Dewey many, many years ago, where he was looking at the cognitive behaviors and how people actually learn. And what he created, and what's often called the Dewey cycle, is this whole idea that we have to have action and reflection, right? There's some type of action that occurs. We have to spend time to think about it and evaluate it in order for that to identify the learning. And so we can do action and not learn. We can do reflection and not learn. It's really moving between those two that allows us to actually learn something. Now, there's also some interesting aspects to this, right? If we're doing this action and reflection, we have to make sure that there's a clear and unambiguous feedback in order for this learning to occur, right? If you can imagine, you run an experiment and the feedback of that is not very clear, you really don't know how it actually performed. So it becomes incredibly important that we have clear feedback. The way the feedback comes back, the less clear it is, the less ability there is to actually learn. And so this is something we want to build into our processes, that the learning is actually a part of how we actually develop or close the loop on gaps. The other piece is that the greater the separation in time and space between the action and the reflection, the more difficult the learning becomes. So if you can imagine, this isn't just on a product basis, this is on an organization as well. I loved what Rich was saying about the balloons, right? Again, you've got an opportunity at an organizational level to identify, hey, I'm going to run an experiment. I want to make sure I get immediate feedback. I want to make sure that it's as binary as possible. And I want to make sure that I jump on that quickly to be able to connect those two. And in the end, that's how we learn, and that's how we can make changes happen. And so if we look at that, then how do we apply this process? And I want to look at it at two levels, and then I'll share how this actually works within an organization as a whole. So if we're going to apply the Dewey cycle, as I was sharing, the first thing obviously is the actions. Once an action occurs, it results in some kind of consequences or some kind of result out of that action. This is where you have the opportunity to do the reflection and the feedback back into the action. And this is what we refer to as a single loop learning. Now, in this case, just doing this is beneficial in and of itself. There's a lot of benefit that can come out of this by just recognizing, here's my input, here's my output, why did that happen, make some modifications. But I'd also like to propose there's actually a deeper one, and that is looking at the underlying assumptions that drive the actions that we take. And this becomes even more important as we look at an organization as a whole, not just our individual actions, although it does apply there. So what we're looking at is when we have results from particular actions, we want to really reflect on the underlying assumptions. Why did we take those particular actions? What is it that was driving a particular behavior to come to a certain mechanism? And this is what we call the double loop learning. All right, so it goes deeper into the actual process to say it's not just the actions and the results, but really trying to understand what's driving and getting to the root of how we can make change happen. And this is really where we have the opportunity to make substantial change, because if we can change the assumptions, then naturally the organization as a whole starts changing the way that they perform. And this is what I'd like to go into a little bit deeper. So if we look at learning at an organizational level, there's things that we're able to observe. For example, events, right? You can see an event that occurred. We can observe that there's patterns in those events. For example, there's a design review. The pattern is we have a design review every month, right? From there, we can get into systemic structures, we get into mental models, we get into visions, right? These get to be to the point that we get deeper into why these patterns occur. So for example, we have a design review. The design review happens every month, but yet every time we launch a product, we find late discoveries on issues with the project, right? So now we start getting into the whole idea of, well, what's driving that? And this is where we have the opportunity as we move up in this sequence that we have increasing leverage, even though it's far more complex, right? Events I can see, patterns I can see. I can't see systemic structures. I can't see mental models. I can't see people's visions. But this is what actually drives the behaviors that actually happen within an organization. And these are the conversations that we ultimately want to get to. And this is one of the things when we get to the learning circles that's fundamental in the conversations that we want to have. It's not just, what event happened. That's data. We can bring that into the room. We can bring in the patterns. But it's talking about why people believe certain things happen, what their vision is, and how we correlate and how we align on things like that. So how do we go about that process? The first one is observation, right? We start out here in the events and the patterns, and we can observe the current events. We can observe the patterns. We can bring in data into a conversation, and we can all align on that particular thing. Yes, that we all see that. Yes, that's the way that operates. What becomes more difficult is really assessing why those observations are there, why we believe certain things happen. And this is where the hard work occurs, right? This is assessing the current systemic structures. When you come into an organization, we all have a different history. We have a different way in which we have grown to where we are. We see issues from a different perspective. maybe we're on the manufacturing side, or we're from the sales side, or in the engineering side. We all see an issue from a different perspective. And this is where we have to break that down and not just talk about an observation of an event, but really talk about what we see and what our mental models around why that occurs based on our perspective. This is where the hard work happens, and this is where the change actually starts to really happen, because what we're trying to do is, from the observations and the assessments, develop new mental models. Hey, if we change the way that we do our design reviews, maybe we don't have enough conversation on what the knowledge gaps are. We should change that. Maybe we don't have the right people in the room. Maybe we're not demonstrating the right things, right? Those are conversations that we want to have, and it allows us to develop new systemic structures, new ways of thinking, new visions as to what the organization might look like. And so this third piece is really to develop that at that higher level, which then allows us to get into implementing some new patterns and some new events. If we change our way of thinking about events and patterns of those events, and we modify at those higher levels, we will change what's actually occurring. And this is where we end up with this whole phases of learning and being able to cycle through this and being able to actually make change happen within an organization. I thought it was very interesting, Rich, what you'd said about talking to your boss. It's amazing how many times we have to back up to that, right? We can talk about what we're seeing all the time, but until we get into how it occurs and what's involved and how they're thinking about it, we're not going to make those changes happen. And so this becomes the fundamentals of how learning occurs and how that gets embedded in an organization and how to make the changes happen. So this is where I want to really get into some of the tools that we'll be talking about and actually using when we get together in our conference or in our session in Ann Arbor. What does it mean, or how do we put this learning into action? And as I mentioned already, one of the things we'll be doing is we're going to have daily learning cycles. So what is a learning cycle? A learning circle. What is a learning circle? A learning circle is simply a group of individuals with a common interest, right? So we all have an interest in making some kind of a change happen. We meet in order to learn from each other about self-identified topics. Whatever it is that we want to bring into that circle, we agree this is something we want to go work on. Now, the learning circles are flexible. They tend to be peer-directed. They're there as a learning experience. And the learning circles are built on the idea that every member in that circle has something to contribute. Every member in that circle has something to learn. And so we have rules that come in. We're not going to get into it here, but we have rules that come into play as to how we make sure that we contribute in that particular manner. So the whole intent of a learning circle is it's structured to lead to action and change. And it goes back to the previous slide, which is all about how do we really understand our mental models? How do we understand our visions in such a way that we can coordinate and actually make some change happen? So how do they work? Learning circles are usually facilitated by some leader. Now, the leader can be an expert, but that's not necessarily the case. As a matter of fact, my experience with it is if they're not a subject matter expert, often it's much better, because their role is really there to facilitate the discussion. Their role is to get the people in that circle to talk. The facilitator may set the agenda and drive the discussion, but they don't want to have some prejudged outcome. So the intent is that as a circle, we're able to really dig into why we have certain beliefs as to why things happen and how we would go about making changes occur. And so what we find in general characteristics, when we think about learning circles, they tend to be small, preferably diverse groups. The greater the diversity, the better the opportunity that you see perspectives from very different ways. There are set ground rules, primarily be respectful, make sure it's a productive discussion. There's never attacking an individual. What we find is that when you're in a learning circle, it's a very vulnerable space, because you're no longer just talking about data, you're talking about feelings. And for many of us as tremendous introverts, technical people, that's not things we like to talk about. but that's where the real learning happens, and that's where change is rooted. We find that they're usually facilitated, but it has to be somebody who's impartial and just basically manages the process, the conversation process. We want to make sure that in a learning circle, we're really proactively looking at issues from different points of view. And there again, the diversity of the group really helps in making sure that we're able to do that. We're looking for learning circles to be a vehicle to discover, to share, to express knowledge, and really fundamentally to learn from others. It really means that we have to spend less time talking and more time listening than what we would have happen in a typical meeting. And really what this is intended to do is really involve this spiraling process of action and reflection that we just talked about. Right? This is what's intended to happen in learning circles. So what's the purpose? Learning circle is simply a tool. Like I said, we'll be exercising this when we're together in October. It's a tool that encourages all the key stakeholders to speak, to listen, participate in whether it's problem solving, making a decision, or learning about a particular topic. And what we're looking to do is the participants need to spend time observing, interpreting, and experiencing not only their own feelings, right? And quite frankly, this often is a very difficult piece. We are programmed to behave based on underlying beliefs that may or may not actually be shown. In most cases, not shown. So bringing those out so others can see and understand is a very, very important aspect of a learning circle. And so what we're trying to do is get other people's viewpoints out, make sure we understand different perspectives on any particular issue, broaden our own understanding. So fundamentally, the purpose of a learning circle is to reflect, so learn, and then take action. So some of the outcomes, what are we looking for? So in a successful learning circle, it's action planning, right? We want to come in in the end have some kind of activity, some kind of action that comes out of the reflection that we do. Learning circles tend to be an affirmation of the participants. And when I say affirmation, it's both in what you believe and why you think certain things happen, as well as affirmation of their points of view. Learning circles are intended to answer questions, so that's part of what we're doing is we're sharing in these learning circles. It's intended to build common ground. How often do we say we want to go in a particular direction as an organization and not have built a common ground with a true understanding? And bear in mind, rather than just saying, hey, we had this action, we're going to change the action from A to B, but really get underlying and say, what do we believe is driving certain behaviors and certain actions, changing at that level and building common ground. It's amazing how effectively the organization gets behind it and makes changes happen. So this whole idea of collaboration in making decision-making as a group by understanding what's behind our behaviors is huge. So they should be fun. What I found in learning circles is it's amazing what you learn, not just about a particular issue or problem that comes in, but also about your peers and the people you work with. And it's a fun exercise to be able to work in that environment. Goal setting, so kind of the same thing as the action planning, but not just the actions, but what's the outcome that we're looking for. And fundamentally, in order for this to really work, there's a huge level of trust that needs to be built up. And so that really requires relationship building at a level that you probably don't have in a regular organization. And so putting these things in action is really a fundamental way in which we're able to really embed learning into our processes, not just learning at a product level, but also learning at an organizational level. And so this is one of the things, as we mentioned, we have a conference coming up in October. This is one of the tools that we will be demonstrating in real. So people are going to be there. This is what we're going to be putting people into as a part of every day. And I hope that all of you that are here are going to be able to make it. and experience this firsthand and take back with you something that's meaningful and useful right from the day you step back into the office or wherever it is you work. So with that, I'll say thank you and turn it back over to Peter.
Yep. Thank you, Dantar. Great. Now I think now we have the possibility to have some question and answers on this. And can take the opportunity to be first out and say, okay, we have the theory, we have the practice with Richard's company, but how easy is it to see when you just go for a visit? I think it's very easy. You see the gadget, you see the dog lying there, and that's what you remember. But if you really want to learn the culture and see the actions, that is a challenge. And perhaps this scientific thinking will help us to do it. Any comments? Rich or Dantar?
Yeah, I'll offer up my perspectives. Obviously, what Dantar is talking about is very consistent with what you will see here at Menlo. Very common, one of the most common phrases here when someone has a new idea is, instead of trying to attack the idea or say, oh, that won't work here, that's not us, we tried that 5 years ago, it didn't work then. Common phrase here at Menlo is, well, let's run the experiment, let's try it, let's see what happens. And so I think a lot of what Dantar is talking about is creating a culture of innovation, as he said in his title, so that in fact fear can be pumped out of the room rather than in. I happen to believe too that physical environments can encourage or discourage depending on how they're set up. Obviously what you'll see here is a big open room, people working shoulder to shoulder, people working in close proximity to one another, because I think in some ways the part of the learning here at Menlo is the serendipitous learning that literally comes from overhearing the ideas of others.
Your learning expectations, Dantar, from on the visit to Menlo Innovation?
Oh, I can't wait to be there, Rich. I think it's going to be fantastic to see. And I always find that
it might as well, it would be silly of me not to give you a sneak preview. So let me just
nice.
Let me walk out here. So
for me, I find it's always interesting to have a framework to bounce this against. So this is fantastic.
This is what it looks like. This is one team. This is the Harrison team working away side by side, shoulder to shoulder. A lot of people wonder, how does it work when they're remote people? Well, this is Keely and Peter working together. Peter is at home in Chicago on the screen. Keely's right here. So there's Ted and Angelina. There's Scott and Alexandra. So, and then of course, oh yes, and couldn't forget the dog. I don't know how you have a learning organization without dogs in the mix. Or thanks, Keely. And then you see, similarly, the space is set up like this for others. And this is maybe where I would speak a little bit to physical organization. We're very different, obviously, than most software companies. The work doesn't come to the people go to the work. So you saw 6 people there together, Keely and Peter, Angelina and Ted, Scott and Alexandra. They were all working on the same project. The Harrison project is one of our code names. When they're assigned to work on the Harrison project, they go to the Harrison pod. In some ways, I think our pod is a physical manifestation of a learning circle.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I'm interested in seeing visual management. I'm curious what kind of do you have boards and you know, I think I remember seeing something from your area where you had a card and you had to fill in the card with a certain number of tasks, and there's only amount of space, certain amount of space, so you can't overload yourself.
The way we manage our projects is right here. So there's the Rambo project, there is the Sting project, there is the Copper project. I don't know if you're seeing them backwards like I am.
No, we see them right.
Okay. And so each one of these cards, each are individual cards here, represent a little piece of work product that the team is working on. They're placed next to the day we expect them to complete based on the estimates that came from the team themselves. And the color-coded sticky dot indicates progress. Yellow says that's the active card. That's the one they're working on. Green says they've completed the work. And so as you look around the room, you see other elements of that. When you come visit, you can have a fun time looking at what we call the levels board here. So that's actually our public display of what everybody's compensation is here and what they are relative to one another. And that's all managed by the team. So yes, we are big believers in physical objects to represent work as opposed
high-speed voice communication, right?
Yes, high-speed voice technology is one of the
that's right, technology.
Yep.
Great, thank you.
That's just a way of getting you a little teased and excited about coming to visit.
Great. Great demonstration. That's much more reliable, or it seems much more truth. You just go out in your business and show it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I have a question for Dantar. Dantar, yes. Can you talk a little about how do you document what happens in learning circles? Does it end up in a knowledge repository? I like the paired programming that Richard does, and we do show and tell where people bring problems to this period of time, and how we work together to try to solve the problems and support each other. Do the learning circles result in some type of knowledge that goes through a knowledge base where it can be accessed in the future?
Yeah, so there's a couple pieces to it. Rich had mentioned one of the books, Peter Senge, and that's really what, in my experience, first getting involved with learning circles, that's what drove that. And so often what you find when you start trying to get the underlying principles behind actions, so mental models, things like that, we'll spend a lot of time with causal diagrams. And so what we're trying to do with causal diagrams is, as a learning circle, continue to peel back the layers of the onion, so to speak, to understand how different things relate to them. And if you think about, say, a development organization, it's very difficult to actually see what's going on. Now, in the case Rich just took us out there, you can see some visual boards, but that's still not overly typical. And so what you're really trying to do is draw pictures of what we think is actually happening. And those become very important documentation of aligning groups in getting to a common way of thinking in their belief systems. So that's really the primary piece that as far as the knowledge, because what that's going to do is, if you can bring it down to a causal diagram perspective, then you can modify the actions or the behaviors based on how you think that they're being driven. Now, the other piece that comes out of that then is, of course, the action planning. Here's the things that we think are going to happen. Here's the steps we're going to go take. And that's really becomes the documentation that comes out of those learning circles.
Thank you.
And I think, Dantar, I would recommend when you're here to ask our team, show us how you draw pictures. What artifacts are you creating when you're discovering and learning things? Because we're probably one of the biggest consumers of foam core boards in Ann Arbor, and so we have lots of physical artifacts of where we've captured ideas, designs, what we call persona maps, which is a very important element of our system here. So you'll see that visual management stuff built into the picture drawing. We're very big on that. Software is way too theoretical to not be able to draw pictures, but a lot of software teams don't draw the pictures. They try and keep the picture in their head, and that picture is usually fuzzy and not the same in everybody's head.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, Rich, because I think that's so fundamental, right? What we talk and what we say is already filtered what's going on in our heads. And really being able to back that off to get into the underlying, here's why I'm saying what I'm saying, here's why I'm thinking what I'm thinking, gets you to a level that you can actually align and draw a common picture. And so, Jeff, what you were saying on the causal diagrams, that's a fundamental piece of how those pictures get drawn. So I'm excited to see what you do there as well, Rich. I think that's.
And here's what I get excited about. We've been doing this stuff for 20 years. You're going to come in and tell us why what we do works so well and why it's so important. We're just doing them because this is how we solve problems, but you're going to come in and tell us the theory by why what we do is so important, which I love.
I had a question for Richard. What improvements came about because of the pandemic in terms of visual management or working remotely in this hybrid type organizations?
Yeah, there were certain things we did in the past that we had to just like do on steroids. For example, you saw Peter and Keeley, a remote pair working. Peter's in Chicago, Keeley's here. Well, we had been doing some version of remote pairing for years, but it was very targeted. It was a small experiment that we'd run for a number of years. And then all of a sudden, one day, everybody had to be remote pairing. It was good that we had run those other experiments because we knew how to do it. And one of the guys here, Nick, had been remote pairing for us for about 4 years. And I think Nick was probably, sort of second-class citizen because he was always in remote. He wasn't going to all the meetings. And then all of a sudden, Nick got elevated to king of the mountain because everybody's going to Nick saying, how'd you make this work? What did you learn the last 4 years that we need to learn in 5 minutes now? And so Nick became very important based on those lessons. But I think now what we've learned, the lessons that came out of the pandemic are we should maintain that flexibility. There was a point where we had a building issue just a couple of months ago, and everybody had to work from home. And guess what? We didn't miss a beat. We were all ready for it. We knew exactly how to do it. And I think those were very practical new innovations that had happened for us through the pandemic that we didn't say, oh, now the pandemic's over, let's dismantle all of that infrastructure. No, we just left it in place and we can use it whenever we need it. I also think the flexibility that we offer our employees now is greater than we ever had before. And so I think we ended up with a better place for our workforce.
Great.
And I will also say, and yes, we learned how to visualize a lot of things with electronic tools that we would normally have done with just with paper.
One question I think of the success of Menlo Innovation is about one of the presentation we will have on the conference from Menlo with high-tech anthropologists, which makes you a bit different, because I think that is something that many companies might take away and say that I understand the customer. Could you expand a bit on what they do?
Yes. And I'll say there are two elements to it, and language, I think, in this context is very important. One is understanding the customer. Now, when we talk about a customer of Menlo, the people who pay us to do work, they're the people sponsoring a software project. They're the the executive who allocated a budget to engage Menlo, and we do have to take care of that customer to make sure we get paid. But our anthropologist job, in addition to understanding the desires, the needs, the problems the sponsor is trying to solve, also have to understand the end users of the software we're designing and building. Completely different audience. You know, if you think we're, and I'll just make this up, we've never done work for Home Depot, but if Home Depot was calling us to design a new point of sale system, we would want to interview the sponsors at Home Depot to understand what it is they need. But then we'd want to go to several Home Depots, watch the clerks who are using the current point of sale system, watch the customers who are doing self-checkout, see what problems they're having, and then trying to imagine what new and better solutions could happen. The high-tech anthropologists will spend far more of their time watching end users, observing them in the native environment of, in this case, again, it's a fictional project. In the case of a Home Depot, we would be at stores. We'd want to make sure we go to a bunch of different stores, that we're not just getting perspectives from a single store. And the anthropologist's job is, first and foremost, at the beginning of a project, is to observe and discover, and later on then do design iterations to test potential solutions for the problems that were discovered during that discovery phase.
That's very interesting. And of course, you work in pairs, so in the conference there will be two high-tech anthropologists. Well,
Yep.
that's great. Only you are unique.
No, they will actually pair me quite often. They know I can do these kind of things without a pair partner, but I'm not. I'm redesigning a course right now, our Lead with Joy course, and they pair me with somebody to do that. So that's been fun to experience that benefit of pairing directly by working with someone.
Great. Any other questions or challenges? As you hear, Rich has been on the journey for 20 plus years, but still wants to learn. So we need to pay back a bit.
I have another
question. I have a question for Dantar. I'm still trying to digest everything you just said. That was also super interesting. I'm just thinking about this learning circles and the scientific method in terms of having that in an environment of researchers who are trained to this scientific method. So how do you see that? What do they need to, or do they need to unlearn something, and how do they need to adapt, like we discussed earlier? You're on mute.
Sorry. That's a great question. I think when we go to school and we learn our craft, so to speak, we learn it in the scientific method. And then we go into industry and somehow that gets stripped off of us, right? It's immediately, well, I've got an idea, so get a solution. It's not figure out the problem, understand, run the experiments, make sure we understand what the safe design zones are, and then come up with a product. We tumble into that by finding problems along the way and then going back and fixing them. And so the unlearning piece is really the idea that going faster is not about setting requirements quicker. Going faster is about learning and understanding the gaps to get them closed effectively. And so that learning process really needs to be focused and targeted. So the unlearning is specifications don't drive a product. The learning and the gaps that need to be closed is what drives an effective product. So that's really the challenge that you have when you put in that scientific method. Does that touch on your question, Mia?
Yeah, it does, and I'm still thinking about these introvert researchers who are very careful about saying anything before they are 127% sure that it's absolutely right and correct.
Mm.
So how do you kind of get them into this sharing and learning and talking about it?
Yeah, as I always like to say, you know, engineers, scientists, they went into that field because they like solving problems, and they're not going to share their problem with anybody else to be able to go solve it, right? And so breaking that down into a forum where they discuss what the gaps are, and realizing that there's a lot of other people that could provide input and may have experience already. That's a huge piece. I started my career at General Motors, and at the time there was 315,000 people worldwide, I think is what the number was. And I still remember, you know, I was young in my career, and I had an older engineer come to me. He looked over my desk, and he saw I was struggling with this problem. And he says, Dantar, he says, the issue here is not solving your problem. The issue here is figuring out who's already solved it and getting connected with them. And so when you start thinking about whether it's learning circles, scientific method, or getting these introverted perfectionists engaged, it really becomes a question of how you break that down, right? And this is part of the unlearning. You break that down to share and define the problem and the learning objectives first, and then figure out how you can do that learning and close that gap effectively. I mean, if you believe that the ones who learn the fastest are the winners, it's also a matter of defining that problem effectively and getting the people focused on it.
Hey, Dantar, a corollary to that is when you do engage with a team, and you may be pushed by management to just do it, and, you know, get the design out there. I took people through what learnings do we need to do. You know, at least let's go through that process of doing that, and that gave everyone a chance to pause and go back through. Here's what we know. Here's what we don't know. And by doing that, we could really lay out what we really needed to do to get to the end result. Now, we didn't have that time. We were not given that time. But from that, before it was just, hey, we're going to take the risk. No, you're not taking a risk. You're just taking a chance. You're just gambling. But now that we know what learnings we really need to do to get to the schedule that we're being mandated to hit, now I know what the risks are.
Mhm.
So that understanding your learning gaps and how you should be proceeding, and if you're not able to try to commercialize something fast, I now know what my risk is and what I'm going to do about it and that sort of thing. So it really is back to that scientific method of trying to fight that desire to just jump in and commercialize and fix it, and to really sit back and understand. So we're just better off as a system when we do that.
Yeah.
Make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's exactly right on.
Yeah.
That's right on.
We knew exactly something, you know, I always use the saying, risk taking is not chance taking. Risk taking means I know exactly what the risk is, where it's going to happen, how I'm going to find out if it's going to happen, when I'm going to what am I going to do? How can I mitigate it? It's 2 or 3 times as hard to figure all that out than just saying, let's take the risk. That's a very easy thing to say as a manager, as a management team, leadership team. It's much harder to really understand what that means.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, me, I guess my background, do we answer your question somewhat?
Yes,
okay,
you did
perfect.
very well. Thank you.
Yeah, otherwise contact me, send me an email. I'm happy to provide more information, more detail, process steps, anything like that if you like.
Perfect. Thanks.
Great. All of this helps our common learning as well.
I have a question for Richard. Will we see, or can you tell us about knowledge capture and knowledge sharing? Do you reuse knowledge? Do you have standard work? Or do you pretty much, are you really on the constant development and everything is new?
It would be virtually impossible in any modern software system to not be leaning on the things that have preceded you. I mean, at the basic level, you're leaning operating systems, you're leaning on frameworks and modules. What's tricky about our industry in general is there are so many of them, and they are coming at us in such a fast fashion that that even feels like new stuff. I mean, probably the simplest example, most salient one of the last few years is cloud-based computing platforms from AWS, from Google, from Microsoft. We are absolutely leaning on those frameworks to do our work and the various other tools that go with them to make those things faster. But they themselves require a tremendous amount of learning in order to be able to use them effectively, efficiently, and accomplish the goals that the companies, that our customers are trying to do. And then layered on top of that is probably what many of you would refer to sort of value stream 3 kind of things, where it is highly customized work based on the exact needs of our clients. And then what we're leaning on there is more of our process to our process. It's very interesting. We do a tremendous amount of new innovation within what is going to look like a standard work process. There's a version of Menlo that I could describe that is absolutely executed faithfully week in and week out, that is standard work. Estimation, planning game, show and tell, work authorization, the yellow dot, orange dot, green dot relationship with each story card as it goes through the process of development to quality assurance, the writing of automated unit tests before the code is written, the cataloging of those tests, the running of all those tests before we check in the code. So there's a lot of things we do that is absolutely well understood, well practiced, and consistently practiced standard work throughout the organization. But in some ways, the beauty of standard work that probably all of you know better than me is it frees up the mind for the creative, innovative work you're trying to do, because you're not spending as much time resolving this fairly routine puzzle that most software teams are always solving over and over and over again, mainly because Joe over in this corner does it one way and Susie over in this corner does it another way. And when you try and bring Joe and Susie's work together, it doesn't work because they took these two vastly different approaches using different tools, different approaches, and different frameworks. We don't have that problem here. It's probably one of the greatest accomplishments we have as an organization is the standardization of the routine stuff so that it allows us to do the innovation on top of it.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Right. We are reaching the end of the session. I think the hunger for seeing Menlo innovation in real life has increased, as well as some thoughts on how we can learn more. So
my only disappointment is I'm going to be in Grand Rapids when you are here, I'm pretty sure. So but you will be well taken care of by my team.
It's great. So thank you a lot for this session, Dantar and Rich and everyone. And thanks, Carolyn, for the discount code also in the chat.
In the chat. Yep. There's so if you're interested in joining us in Ann Arbor, I put a discount code in the chat for 20% off. So hopefully you take that and use that, please. And please join us.
And there's a link in the chat as well to the conference.
Great. So we hope we can meet soon again and in person with a lot of you.
Looking forward to it.
Great.
Wonderful conference. I mean, wonderful session, Dantar and Richard. Thank you
very much.
Richard, thank you for your time as well.
Yeah.
I know it's valuable.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
And thanks for the extra tours.
Bye.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you.